Hello everyone, this is June, and in this video, we'll be taking a brisk look at the new battles added in the 6.2 patch. This isn't so much a guide, but more of my observations and impressions of the encounters. From the parts I enjoyed, which sections I found were done well, what could be improved, and to the little things that caught my eye. Nothing too wildly in-depth. That being said, spoiler alert. For starters, overall, I'm pretty satisfied with the new fights they added. And when I say new fights, I mean the new EX trial, the Unreal, and the 4 normal raids. I've had an enjoyable time running them with people in Duty Finder, Party Finder, and with friends. As a whole, I'd say the main thing most of the encounters succeed at is that the fights have much better pacing, and I think this is especially the case if we're comparing the old raids, the previous tiers raids, with the new raids that have just come out. I'll elaborate about this more in a bit. Of the instances they added in this update, the ones I found the most entertaining are actually Unreal Separat and the Storm's Crown Extreme, aka Barbarisia. Something these two fights excel at, and something I'll compliment for the new fights overall, as mentioned before, is the pacing. With these two fights, there's almost always something going on, and something to pay attention to on the screen. The dead moments where the boss doesn't do anything before finally casting something is kept to a minimum. Specifically in the case of Separat, he goes from doing back-to-back raid wides to back-to-back busters, all with no cast bars, and then he jumps into the next mechanic almost immediately. There's constant movement required from the players and repositioning of the boss. There's constant AoEs, and there's just constant incoming damage, and I think these things are great because these things contribute to the fight feeling speedy and avoids being stagnant. Now, these are the most challenging fights, but in 14 I value an encounter being enjoyable to play on repeat or to rerun for farm parties more than being overly complex or overly difficult or super complex for complexity's sake. And I found these two fights to be good examples of that. I personally prefer boss fights that focus on visual tells and a focus on player reactions, more so than solving these debuff puzzles. How to resolve a series of debuffs and stand in the right place, you know the deal. I wasn't personally around for the Heavensward era, so outside of some unseen clears I did for the mounts during my Stormblood days, so I was able to go into this fight without too much bias or too much previous knowledge. By the nature of the fight designs in this game, there's always going to be scripted constants, no matter what kind of fight it is. But EX Separat is great at feeling freeform and varied despite those kinds of restrictions. I think it's a good combination of requiring to memorize the dance, but also reacting on the fly. The player is also able to be extremely flexible and adaptable. For example, someone with the orange debuff is normally expected to back off towards the south to be safe from the green AoEs, but actually, there's enough room at the north to squeeze into a safe spot on the sides for a melee player to get full uptime, assuming the green group stacks tight and doesn't spread the AoEs. Or another example, during the towers during the green and orange debuffs, usually the tower can only be taken by the orange players. If players are missing, a green player can sacrifice themselves, or a tank can burn an invul, like Hollowed or Holmgang, to step into the tower as a green debuff to preserve the pool. And I think this flexibility adds a lot of dimension and rewards players for paying attention, not for just doing it correctly, but for being alert and aware of the fight itself. And it gives players moments to recover the fight. For another example, during the final tower with the ads and the twister, the group can choose to use LB3 in multiple ways. They can let the tank LB3 it to mitigate all the incoming damage, because the boss is doing raid wides at that point too. The melee can choose to LB3 the win ad so that it's not an issue while the rest of the players are dealing with their shit. Or the caster can LB3 the entire ad set to hit everything in one go. Or the party can choose to save the LB3 for the healer to clean up the mess after it's been made. So this can all be chosen based on the current state of the fight, so it's extremely adjustable, and the combination of all these things makes the fight feel very fluid. I hope they try designing more in this direction for future encounters. I realize this is an old fight, but they really don't make fights like this anymore. As far as Unreals go, for the most part, I've had a good time with the versions of the bosses they've included, except for maybe like Ultima's Bane. I'm hoping they consider including them into some kind of more permanent form, put them into some kind of Unreal rotation of the ones they've done already. Admittedly, it's kind of a drag to have only one available for like 6 months or so, or whatever raid cycle we're on, only for these newly tuned fights to go away forever. It's kind of a shame. So maybe this is in part from doing Unreal first. Barbarisia feels like something of a modern take on this style. Her fight's not nearly as speedy or speedy feeling as Sephiroth, and she auto-centers herself the entire encounter, so manual boss positioning isn't a component of the fight. However, especially during her second and fourth phases, where she's going crazy with the punches, the essence of reacting to visual tells, and the emphasis of paying attention to the elements of the boss and on the field itself, as opposed to focusing on cast bars or debuffs, and the constant incoming raid damage, these parts are pretty reminiscent and similar to the Swole Triad. And the presentation and the visual chaos contributes to the fight feeling more so. Now, while I do praise the free-form nature of the fight, one thing that stood out to me is that tank responsibility is incredibly low. Main tank, off tank really isn't a thing in this fight, and outside of a couple busters that require tank swaps, it's all kind of a formality, and she doesn't really auto-attack all that much. In the second phase, she's turning around all over the place when she's doing those dash punches, and you get sent to random directions during the Island Sanctuary hair mechanics for the enums. And on top of that, she jumps to the center almost after every mechanic, so you pretty much have very little agency or control in terms of where she is or how to face her. I'd say if it wasn't for the tank busters, or the flares the tanks have to resolve, this EX encounter could probably be done with 6 DPS and 2 healers without much of a problem. In return, I feel like they put in more of a focus on raid-wide damage, especially in the second phase. There's just a lot of damage done to the entire party constantly, whether it's her raid-wides or the circle AoEs. I'm not sure how I feel about the tank responsibilities being diminished in this way, but what I do appreciate is that it contributes to the fight feeling fresh and different, because it breaks the mold of what we're used to and what we expect from a 14 boss or raid. Also, the second phase and fourth phase in particular is where the concept of positionals start to feel pointless, considering how much she spins around and how the player has almost no control of where to face her. I feel like in those phases, she should have been omnidirectional. I think that would have been something to consider. Cosmetically speaking, I do dig this more Anga representation of her compared to her original FF4 version. Also, big fan of her voice lines. I wasn't the biggest fan of the previous tier, and this includes both the normal and savage versions of encounters. So my bar coming into this new patch was very low, and admittedly, I was pretty skeptical. That being said, I think Abyssos is a big improvement from Asphodelos, and I really enjoyed the fights. Based on the strength of these normals, I'm looking forward to the Savage versions. While they don't have the breakneck pacing I've praised from the Unreal, there's less downtime in between the cast bars, and the bosses are more active in setting up their attacks. And in the situations where the bosses aren't doing anything, I feel like they did their best to fill in the gap visually. There's also more attacks that rely heavily on visual tells, and a lot of the attacks rely on paying attention to the boss's animation, as well as the move they're casting. Now, of course, the normal versions will be considerably easier than the Savage counterparts, but there's enough in there to make me think about what could be included, or what will be derived from these default versions of encounters, and I think this is great. Real talk. At the end of the day, Abyssos doesn't do anything revolutionary with the mechanics, and I don't think it's reasonable to expect something like that, and it's not something I'm hoping for. What I mean by this is, while there are new boss models, attack effects, arenas, and etc., the fights are still foundationally what we expect from a 14 boss encounter. If I were to narrow it down, under a more cynical viewpoint, most 14 boss encounters are designed around players finding safe spots, and these safe spots vary in size and shape. One time they can be big as half the arena, Another time, they can be a tiny opening created by multiple overlapping AoEs. Sometimes, they require you to resolve them by yourself, and sometimes they require you to resolve them with multiple people with these additional conditions, like stack markers or debuffs that require you to stack with a particular player, or enumerations, etc. Now, to clarify, this isn't really a fault or a flaw of the game. It's just what the fights are fundamentally designed around. The encounters rely on this sort of design, and the fights work because they design the fights around these concepts. However, the longer you play the game, the more you get accustomed to this mechanical vocabulary. And the more you are aware of what the designers are trying to do, you can only dodge so many chariots and dynamos until it starts to feel stale. What ends up working is when an encounter rearranges and presents these familiar, tried and true concepts in unfamiliar ways with unique visuals, and make them flow in an engaging fashion and have good pacing and wrap them all up in enticing visuals and aesthetics. A fight can feel more than being more of the same with the same old mechanics with just a fresh coat of paint, even though in actuality that's what it is. Some encounters excel at this, some not so much. When these things are done well, it's when a boss fight feels challenging, fun, or sometimes both. And when it's not done well, a fight can feel slow, repetitive, derivative, or sometimes straight up boring. With the Abyssos normal encounters, I think they've succeeded with this, and I do consider them fun. So you might be thinking, dude, these are just normals. Of course, in the Savage versions, they are expected to go crazier, where they add a bunch of new debuffs, new mechanics and properties, and sometimes phases that don't exist in the normal versions. But not all mechanics from normal carry over to Savage either. That being said, a good amount of normal mechanics are actually clues and references to what will be in the higher difficulty. So I do put a big merit on the normal versions feeling engaging. It gives me incentive to think about what's going to be in the next version of the fight. My personal favorite of the 4 normal raids is P7N. At first glance, it's an extremely third fight feeling, third fight of a tier. She's got a comically gigantic omnidirectional hitbox, auto attacks that hit both tanks, gigantic arena filling AoEs, attacks that change the shape of the arena. Familiar stuff. It feels like a beefed up 8-man alliance raid. It's quite fun. I do like the unique arena shape and how the attacks create very specific safe spots. I have a feeling the Savage version will be the gatekeeper in PF this time around, especially more so because of the way it's murdering players left and right in the normal version. In closing, the new fights do have better pacing compared to the previous tier. I'm a big fan of the Unreal and the EX Trial, and I hope they do design more fights in this style. And based on what was shown in the normals, I am looking forward to the Savage versions of these encounters. Thanks for watching or listening. I know this was a little bit different from what you're used to from this channel. That being said, I am having a good time with the content, so it's probably safe to expect at least a couple videos out of me this patch cycle. I hope everyone has a good morning, afternoon, or evening, and that you have a great patch day on Tuesday. Until then, happy raiding.